She had rehearsed the sentence for 11 days, all the way from the Missouri, and every time she said it over in her head it came out sounding worse. There was no soft way to tell a man who had written for a wife that 3 children were coming with her. She had tried it 100 ways against the rattle of the cars and the creak of the freight wagon, and every version ended the same, with a stranger's face closing like a door. And so by the last afternoon Adeline Rourke had given up on softness altogether and settled on the plain truth, said quick, the way you pull a splinter. What she did not know, sitting up on that jolting wagon seat with a sleeping child in her lap and 2 more wedged behind her among the crates, watching the long brown Wyoming grass run away to the mountains, was that the man waiting at the end of that road had a plank over his gate with 1 name cut in it and room for more. And that before the sun went down on the day she arrived, he would have that plank off its brackets and across 2 sawhorses in the yard, and the shavings would be curling up off it pale and sweet in the last of the light. If this story speaks to you, hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. It was the 2nd week of May in the year 1887, and the country north of Camas Bend was the greenest it would be all year. Her oldest, Nell, who was 8 and missed nothing, had been counting antelope since noon and had got to 51. Josiah, who was 6 and was called Joss by everyone including himself, had asked the freighter 11 separate questions about the mountains and received 11 separate grunts and had not been discouraged by a single one of them. And the baby, Bertie, who was 3.5 and had a way of falling asleep in the middle of a sentence, slept with her cheek against her mother's collarbone and her fist wound so tight in the fringe of Adeline's shawl that the shawl had begun to pull loose from her shoulder. That shawl was the last good thing Adeline owned. It was a deep cornflower blue, wool, bought new in a better year, and against the dust gray of her traveling dress, it was the only color on her. And she had put it on that morning at the road ranch because a woman meeting a man she had agreed to marry ought to have one thing about her that was not worn out. The dress underneath it was patched at both elbows and turned at the hem. Her boots had been resoled twice by a cobbler, who told her frankly that there would not be a third time. She had $4.60 sewn into the lining of her cuff and a canvas grip with everything the 4 of them owned in it, and she had a letter in her pocket from a man named Owen Talent, who ran cattle on Camas Creek, and had written that he would meet her at the crossroads on any day she named. She had settled on 1 sentence. On the last afternoon, jolting north from the railhead with Bertie asleep against her. That was what she was going to say. She had turned it over so many times that the words had gone smooth, like a stone in a pocket. I have 3 children and no name to give them. The freighter's name was Dobb Shanley, and he had hauled for the Camas Bend country 11 years, and had said perhaps 24 words since the railhead, most of them to the mules. He was a wide, sunburned, mustached man of about 60, who chewed and spat and drove with his elbows on his knees, and he had not asked her one question about herself, which she had been grateful for, and had not looked at the children twice, which she had been more grateful for. But 3 miles short of the crossroads he took the cut out of his cheek, considered the road ahead, and said, without turning his head, you'd be going out to Talent's. I would. He spat over the wheel. He know about the young ones? She sat very still. Nell, behind her, had gone still too, in the particular way that a child goes still when she hears that the ground she is standing on may not be ground. He does not, Adeline said. Shanley chewed nothing for a while. The mules leaned into the last grade before the crossroads and the wagon groaned. Well, he said at last, there's worse men in this country to spring it on. It was not comfort exactly, but it was the first thing anyone had said to her in 11 days that did not require her to be brave, and she found her eyes stinging and looked hard at the mountains until it passed. Shanley pulled up at the store, set the brake, and said, "He'll be along. He's never late, but he's never early neither," and swung down to see to his freight, and that was the extent of his delivering her. Adeline lifted Bertie down, and Joss climbed over the wheel by himself and fell the last 2 feet, and got up before anyone could make anything of it, and Nell handed down the grip and then came down after it, and the 4 of them stood in the sun on the trampled dirt in front of the store with everything they owned at their feet. A woman came out onto the porch drying her hands on a towel. She was near 50, gray coming in at the temples, built square, with a face that had been out in weather a long time and had made its peace with it. She looked at Adeline. Then she looked at the 3 children, and her eyebrows went up perhaps 1/4 of an inch and came back down, and that was all the comment she made. "You'll want water," she said. "Road dust is worse than the road." "Thank you." "Yes, Hattie Pell. My husband and I keep the store." She brought a dipper and a bucket out and let the children drink first without being asked, which Adeline noticed, and she stood back while they did it with her arms folded. Bertie drank with both hands on the dipper and got most of it down her front. Nell drank quickly and neatly and said, "Thank you, ma'am." Joss drank and then asked Hattie Pell whether the mountains had a name, and Hattie Pell told him they had 4 or 5 depending on who you asked, and Joss said that was too many, and Hattie Pell said she had always thought so herself. Then she straightened up and looked out toward the north road and said, "There he comes." Adeline's whole body went cold and then hot. She turned. There was a rider coming down the north road at a long, easy trot, leading a second horse and with a light spring wagon nowhere in sight, and for one wild moment she thought, "He has brought no wagon. He has brought a saddle horse for one person." And of course he has, because he is expecting one person. He came on. He got larger. She had time to see that he was tall and rode loose and easy the way a man rides who has spent more of his life on a horse than off it, that he wore a dark work shirt and a leather vest gone the color of a saddle and a hat that had been shaped by weather rather than by any store, and that he had a short dark beard and, when he was near enough, a pair of gray-green eyes that took in the porch, and the grip at her feet, and the 3 children standing in a row beside it, and did not move at all. He drew up. He did not dismount right away. He sat his horse and looked at the 4 of them, and Adeline made herself stand straight with her hands folded and her chin up and did not look away, because she had decided somewhere back on the Missouri that whatever happened she was not going to let it happen to her with her eyes down. The wind came across the crossroads and took the dust up in a low sheet and laid it down again. Nell had moved, without seeming to, half a step in front of Joss. Bertie had wound her fist back into the blue shawl. "Mrs. Rourke," he said. His voice was low and unhurried and gave her nothing. "Mr. Talent." He got down. He did it without any hurry either, and he wrapped his rein once around the rail and came up onto the packed dirt in front of her and took off his hat, which she had not expected, and held it against his leg. Up close he was younger than his handwriting and more tired than his letters. There was a white seam of an old scar through one eyebrow, and his hands were the hands of a man who had never in his life been paid to do anything indoors. "You'll have had a long ride from the cars," he said. "We did." "You did," he said. Not a question. He was looking at the children now, openly, one after another, the way a man looks at a thing he is going to have to make a decision about and does not intend to pretend he is not looking at. Nell looked back at him. Nell had her father's straight brown hair and her mother's straight spine, and she looked back at Owen Talent with all 8 of her years and did not blink, and Adeline saw the corner of his mouth do something small and quickly put away. And then he turned back to Adeline and waited, and she understood that he was not going to ask. He was going to stand there in front of the store with his hat in his hand and let her say it in her own words in her own time, and that was somehow harder than being asked, and it was also the first kindness he ever did her, though neither of them would have called it one that day. So she said it. She said it the way she had rehearsed it, quick. The way you pull a splinter, in a voice that came out steadier than she had any right to expect. I have 3 children, she said, and no name to give them. Their father is 19 months dead, and his people want nothing to do with them, and the name they carry is worth exactly nothing in this country or any other. I did not write it to you. I should have, and I did not, and I have known every mile of the way out here that it was a coward's thing to do, and I am not going to stand here and pretend it was anything else. You wrote for a wife. You did not write for 4 people. If you want to put us back on Shanley's wagon, I will not say one word against you to anybody, and I will not cry about it on this porch, and I would take it as a kindness if you would tell me now and not walk it around the block first. Owen Talent did not answer for what felt to her like a year and was in truth about 4 seconds. He turned his hat once in his hands. Then he crouched down, which put him below eye level with all 3 of them, and he said to the oldest, "What do they call you?" "Nell." "Nell what?" "Nell Rourke." "Nell Rourke," he said, as if he were setting it somewhere he could find it again. He looked at the boy. "And you?" "Josiah, everybody says Joss." "Joss, then." And then to the small one, who had her face turned into her mother's skirt and one eye showing, "And this one?" "Bertie," said Nell, when it was clear Bertie was not going to. "Her real name's Bernadette, but nobody's ever used it." "Bertie," he said. He stood up. He put his hat back on and settled it with one knuckle, and he looked at Adeline for a long moment with an expression she could not read at all, and then he said the thing that she would repeat, word for word, without ever once getting it wrong, for the next 43 years of her life. "Then it's 5 names," he said, "not 1. She did not understand him. She heard the words, and they did not fit any of the shapes she had been braced for, and she stood there in the road dust with her heart going like a bird in a box and said, "I don't take your meaning." "You will directly," he said. "Mrs. Pell, could I have the loan of your spring wagon till Thursday?" "It's hitched," said Hattie Pell from the porch, in a voice that was working hard at being ordinary. "Has been this half hour." "That's a good deal of guessing, Hattie. I guessed when I saw 4 people get off that freight in 1 grip," said Hattie Pell. "Go on and take it before I say something I'll be shamed of." So they went out to Camas Creek in a borrowed spring wagon with the canvas grip in the bed and the saddle horse trailing behind on a lead, and it was 4 miles and a little, north and west, up out of the crossroads and along a bench of grass with the creek running silver in the willows below on the left hand and the whole blue wall of the mountains standing up ahead. Joss rode on the seat between them because he could not be prevented. Nell sat in the wagon bed with her back against the sideboard and Bertie in her lap and did not say anything for 2 miles, which was Nell's way of thinking hard. Owen drove. He talked to the boy the whole 4 miles and told her, in between, the plain particulars of the place he was taking her to, and not one word about anything else. "You have not," she said at last, "said anything about the children." "No, Mr. Talent. We're near the gate," he said. "It'll say it better than I will." The gate to the Talent place stood where the wagon road left the bench and dropped toward the creek crossing, and it was not much of a gate as gates go. 2 cedar posts sunk deep and a crossbar between them, and a wire gate hung in the gap beneath. What made it worth looking at twice was the plank. It was a piece of clear pine about 6 feet long and 8 inches deep, silvered by weather to the color of a dove's wing, and it hung above the crossbar on 2 hand-forged iron brackets, and it had been planed smooth and cut into with a chisel by somebody who knew how to do it. Deep letters with clean shoulders that the weather had softened but not taken. And there was one name on it. One name, cut a hand's width in from the left end, and after it the long empty run of clean silvered pine going all the way to the other bracket, 4.5 feet of nothing. Owen pulled up under it and set the brake, and sat looking up at his own name the way a man looks at something he has been avoiding for 6 years. He turned on the seat and looked at her. "Mrs. Rourke, you told me you had 3 children and no name to give them. I heard you. Now hear me, because I'm going to say it the once and then I'm going to go do it instead of talking about it. I did not ride away for a wife because I wanted a housekeeper. I've kept that house 6 years, and it's clean, and I hate every room of it. I wrote because the board over my gate has one name on it, and I am 34 years old, and I did not care to die with it still reading the same. You have come out here with 3 that need a place. I have got a place with nobody in it. There is not a thing wrong with that trade that I can see, and if there is, I'd be obliged if somebody would point it out to me, because I have been trying for 4 miles to find it, and I cannot." Adeline Rourke discovered that she could not speak at all. He gathered the lines. "That's the whole of my speech. I've never made a longer one, and I don't intend to again." Then he clucked to the horse and drove down through the creek, crossing with the water breaking white over the spokes, and Joss hanging over the sideboard to watch it, and Adeline sat with her hands in her lap and the blue shawl slipping off one shoulder, and her eyes streaming, silently, in the way of a woman who has held a thing up for 19 months and has just had it taken out of her hands, without being asked to explain why it was heavy. He had the plank down off its brackets before he had so much as gone into the house. He unhitched and turned the horse out and told Joss where the pump was and Nell where the woodbox was, and then he went straight out to the shed and came back with 2 sawhorses and set them up in the swept dirt in front of the porch, and walked back down the road bareheaded in the long yellow light, and came back up carrying that 6-foot plank on his shoulder like a man carrying a beam, and laid it across the horses, and went for his tools. Adeline stood on the porch step with Bertie on her hip and did not offer to help, because she understood, without being told, that she was watching a thing that had to be done by one particular pair of hands. He took the plank down to fresh wood first. He had a jack plane with a rosewood tote worn dark, and a blade he stopped twice to hone on a stone he kept in his vest pocket, and he set his feet and ran that plane the length of the board in long, even strokes, and the shavings came up off it in pale curls that caught the light and went over his shoulder and lay in the dirt in drifts. And the silver weathered face of the plank went away stroke by stroke, and under it the pine came up the color of new cream, and his own name, the one name, the 6 years of it, went away with the shavings and was simply gone. Joss came and stood at the end of the sawhorse and watched with his mouth open. Nell came out with the water bucket and forgot she was carrying it. When the board was clean, he sighted down it and blew the dust off and took a carpenter's rule and a scrap of pencil and stepped off 5 spaces along it and marked them and stood a minute studying the marks and then rubbed 2 of them out and set them again wider, and Adeline understood that he was making sure there was room, and her throat closed. "Ma'am," he said, without looking up, "how is it spelled?" "Adeline, the rest of it?" "Just Adeline," she said. "The rest of it isn't mine to give away, and it isn't theirs to keep, and I would as soon it went in the creek. He nodded once, as though she had told him the weather, and did not ask another word about it, and picked up his chisel. He cut her name first, and the sound of it went out across the yard in the evening, quiet, talk, 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 and the first swallows came out over the meadow. And the light went from yellow to amber to the deep gold that lies along the underside of things just before it goes. He finished her name and blew the chips out of it and set his thumb in the A and did not say anything. Then he cut Nell's. Nell had come to stand at the corner of the sawhorse by then, and she watched every stroke of it. And when the last letter was pared out, she reached over and put 2 fingers in the groove of the N without asking anybody. And Owen Talent said, "That's right. It don't count till somebody's touched it," which Adeline was fairly sure he had invented on the spot, and which became, in that family, gospel for 3 generations. Then Josiah, which was the longest, and took him into the failing light. And he sent Joss for the lantern, and the boy ran the whole way there and the whole way back with it swinging, and the flame nearly out. And then Bernadette, because Adeline said, when he asked, cut it out full. She'll want the whole of it some day, even if nobody uses it. And so he cut the whole of it, all 10 letters, working now in lantern light, with the moths coming in over his shoulder. And last of all, at the far end of the board, in the space that was left, he cut his own. Owen. 4 letters. He did it fast and without any ceremony, and stood back and looked at the board, 5 names in a row on clean pine, with the shavings drifted under the sawhorses and the lantern hissing. And the dark come down all around the little island of light. It was, by then, perhaps an hour past sundown. He had said before dark, and he had missed it by an hour, and neither of them ever once counted that against him. He carried it down to the gate with the lantern hooked over his wrist, and Adeline came, with Bertie asleep on her shoulder, and Nell and Joss came, and the 4 of them stood in the road in the dark while he set the plank up on its brackets and drove the pins home with 2 taps apiece and stepped back. The lantern swung. The letters came up out of the shadow, 5 names deep cut in new wood. And Nell, who had not cried once in 19 months, not at the funeral, and not at the sale of the furniture, and not on any of the 11 days of the road, put her face into her mother's side and cried like the child she had not been allowed to be since October of 1885. And her mother stood in the dark road with one child asleep on her shoulder, and one crying into her skirt, and one holding the lantern up as high as his arms would go so the letters would show, and looked at her own name cut into a stranger's gate, and understood that the 11 days were over, and that whatever else this country was going to be, it was going to be theirs. He let them stand under it as long as they wanted to. Then he said, more quietly than he had said anything all that day, "The name is a small thing, and it is not a small thing. Out here a person's got no papers most of the time. What you've got is what the country knows about you. And what this country is going to know by Thursday is that there's 5 people belong on Camas Creek, and one of them is a woman named Adeline, and 3 of them are hers, and one of them is me. Whether you and I suit each other is a separate question, and I'll not crowd you on it. You can have the house, and I'll have the bunkhouse for as long as you want it that way, a month or a year. And if it never suits, then it never suits. And you'll still have a roof, and the young ones will still have a place, and I'll not put any of you on a wagon over it." Then he took up the lantern and walked the 4 of them back up the road to the house, and nothing more was said about it that night. They ate their first supper in that house at 9 o'clock at night, which was a scandalous hour by any standard Adeline had been raised to, and nobody in the 4 rooms cared. There were 2 plates in the cupboard, and 1 tin pie pan, and a shallow bowl, and a wooden trencher that had been used for kneading, and Owen set all 5 of them out on the table without a word of apology, and Adeline made a skillet of cornmeal and bacon, and a pot of coffee for the grown people, and warmed milk for Bertie. And they sat down, 5, around a table that had been set for one every night for 6 years. It was at that table, with the plates not matching and the lamp between them, that Joss asked where the board over the gate had come from, and Owen Talent, who did not know how to answer a question by halves, told them. My grandfather cut the first of these on a cabin door in the Willamette country in 1851, he said. The way he had it, a place don't know who it belongs to unless you tell it. So you tell it. Every soul that belongs here gets their name in the board over the gate, and it's the living ones only, and when one goes you plane the board and cut the rest of them fresh so it's always true. My father brought the notion over the pass with him in 68 and hung that plank the year he took this ground. There's been as many as 7 names on it, my father, my mother, my 2 sisters that married off to Oregon, my brother that died at 11, an old man named Sweetwater Charlie that lived in the bunkhouse 9 years and had no other place to be, and me. When my mother went 6 years back this June, I planed it and cut it fresh, and there was one name left to cut, and I cut it, and I have rode under it twice a day, every day since, and I have hated the sight of it worse than any other thing on this place, and I could not have told you why until that afternoon in front of Pell's store. Joss fell asleep in the middle of eating and had to be carried. Nell washed up and would not be argued out of it, and when it was done, Owen took the lantern up the loft ladder and came down and said the loft was dry and there was a straw tick up there wanted freshening but would do for tonight, and that the 2 young ones could have the back room where the good bed was, and that he had a bedroll and there was a stove in the bunkhouse. And he took his hat off the peg and went out into the dark, before Adeline had assembled a single word to stop him with. She stood a long while in the middle of that kitchen, which was clean the way he had said it was, and unlived in the way he had said it was, with the 4 rooms of it dark around her and her 3 children breathing in 2 of them. What she stood there thinking about was the lie. The letter was still in her pocket, folded and unfolded so many times that the creases had gone soft as cloth, written in a square, careful hand that pressed hard enough to emboss the back of the page, and she knew every line of it, that he was 34 years old, that he had a house with a good roof and a spring that had never gone dry, that he did not drink, that he had been alone 6 years since his mother died, and had lately found he did not care for it, and that if a decent woman were willing to come out to a hard country and take a chance on a man she had never met, he would meet her at the crossroads on any day she named. He had not asked what she looked like. That was the thing she kept coming back to. 4 men had answered the notice she had put in the matrimonial paper, and 3 of them had wanted to know what she looked like, and 1 of them had wanted a likeness sent before he would write again, and only Owen Talent had asked instead what she could do, whether she minded cold, and whether she would want a garden. She had written back that she could do most things, that she had been cold before, and that she would want a garden very much. She had written it late at night in a rented room in Council Bluffs with the children asleep 3 in a bed behind her, and she had picked up the pen 4 times to tell him about them and set it down 4 times without doing it, and each time she set it down she told herself she would put it in the next letter. There had been 3 more letters. She had not put it in any of them. That was the whole of her crime, and she knew exactly how large it was, and she had spent 11 days on the road knowing it. It was not that she had meant to trick him. She had lain awake in that Council Bluffs room doing the arithmetic that a widow with 3 children and $4 does, over and over. And the arithmetic always came out the same. If she wrote it, he would say no. Every one of them said no. She had answered notices for a year and a half, and she had learned to see the shape of the refusal coming before it arrived, the letter that got shorter, the letter that mentioned a change in circumstances, the letter that did not come at all. A woman alone was a possibility. A woman with 3 children was a debt, and men in a hard country did not marry debts. So she had written nothing about them, and she had used the last of Tom's railroad money on 4 tickets west, and she had told herself, in the long dishonest hours before sleep, that if she could only stand in front of the man and let him see her face while she said it, he might hear it differently than he would have read it. She had not believed that. She had simply had nothing else. Then she took the blue shawl off her shoulders and hung it on the peg beside his hat, because a shawl on a peg by the door is the smallest possible way a woman can say that she is not leaving. And she blew out the lantern and went up the ladder to the loft. In the morning she woke before light out of pure habit and lay in the dark with the strange smell of the place around her, pine and cold ash and lamp oil, and under it all, the sweet green smell of the meadow coming up through the shakes, and she heard, below and outside, the pump handle going, and knew he had been up an hour. She came down and had the fire lit and the coffee on before he came in, and he stopped in the door with his hat in his hand the way he had stopped in the road at the store, and looked at the lit kitchen and the woman in it, and said, "That's the first fire in that stove I never built myself," and hung his hat and sat, and that was breakfast. He had answered every question Joss put to him on the ride out the evening before, all the way in full sentences, without once sounding like a man being pestered. Yes, there were elk. No, not in summer. They went up. Yes, he had shot a bear once and had not liked doing it and had not done it since. Yes, the creek had fish. No, the boy could not go to the creek alone until he had been shown which parts of it would take a person off their feet, and he was shown that morning before the dishes were dry. And to Adeline, in between, not looking at her, in the same plain voice, he had given her the things she needed, that the house had 4 rooms and a loft, that the loft was dry and warm and had been his when he was a boy, that there were 2 beds and he would build more, that there were 41 head of cattle and 220 acres deeded with a great deal more grass behind it that nobody yet held, that he owed $190 on a haymower and nothing else in the world, and that the spring above the house had run through the drought of '86, when every other spring on that side of the creek had quit. She had come up that road too frightened to look at the country, and she looked at it now, from the porch step, with a cup going cold in her hand, and had no words ready for it. She had been raised in a river town in Illinois where the horizon was always a mile off and hung with smoke, and out here the horizon simply refused to arrive. The grass ran east until it stopped being grass and became color, and the mountains stood along the west the way a wall stands, blue at the bottom and white at the top, and between the two there was a wind that never entirely quit and smelled of sage and wet ground and something else she could not name, some clean, cold green smell that she would learn later was the smell of snow melting 40 miles away and coming down the creeks. The gate had been up 11 hours before the country knew about it. Dob Shanley came down from the north on his Thursday run and pulled his mules to a walk at the Talent Gate, because a plank cut all in new wood catches the eye when you have looked at the same silvered board twice a week for 11 years. And he read it from the wagon seat, all 5, and said aloud to the mules, "Well, I'll be dogged." and drove on to the crossroads and told Hattie Pell. And Hattie Pell told the blacksmith's wife, and by Saturday there was not a soul between Camas Bend and the head of the creek who did not know exactly what Owen Talent had done on the evening of the 10th of May. It made talk. Adeline had known it would, and had braced for the shape of it. And the shape it took was not the one she expected. She had expected the talk to be about her, the widow who had come out under false colors with 3 children hidden in her pocket, and there was a little of that, mostly from 2 or 3 of the sort of people who are in every settlement and will be in the last one. But that was not the main current. The main current was the board, in a country where nothing was written down, where a man's ground was held by a claim number and his word, where half the families had come from somewhere they did not talk about, and a third of the children answered to names that were not on any paper anywhere. 5 names cut a 1/4 inch deep in clean pine over a gate was the loudest public act anybody in Camas Bend had witnessed in years. It was not a private kindness. That was the whole point of it and the reason it worked. Owen Talent had not taken her aside and told her gently that the children were welcome. He had gone out in the last of the daylight and cut a permanent record in a piece of wood that every freighter and rider and neighbor on that road would pass under twice a week for the rest of their lives, and by doing it he had made the question of whether the Rourke children belonged on Camas Creek into a matter of public fact rather than private charity. There is a great difference between the two, and every person in that valley over the age of about 9 understood it perfectly. Nell understood it before anybody. She walked down to that gate by herself on the second morning, alone, out of the yard and down the wagon road, a 1/4 mile in the wet grass with the dew soaking her hem, and stood under it a long while looking up. Adeline watched her go from the porch and did not follow. When the girl came back, her face was scrubbed of everything, the way it went when she was determined not to be seen feeling anything. And she said, "It's cut deep. It is. Deep as his. Deeper than his, I think," said Adeline. "He got hasty at the end because it was dark." "It won't wash off," Nell said. It was not a question, and she did not wait for an answer, and she went and got the egg basket and did the hens, and that was the whole conversation, and Adeline had to go inside and stand with her hands flat on the table for a minute before she could go on with the morning. The crossroads at Camas Bend was not a town so much as an argument for one. There was a store with a long porch and a hitch rail worn shiny, a blacksmith's open shed with the fire banked, a stage barn, a schoolhouse that doubled for church, and 11 or 12 frame and log houses set down without any apparent plan in the elbow of the creek. And behind all of it the country simply opened again and went on. They were married on the 4th of June in the schoolhouse at Camas Bend by a circuit preacher named Hoyt, who came through every 3rd week, and there were 40-some people there, which was more than had come to any wedding in that country in 3 years, and every single one of them had come to see the family that had a gate. Hattie Pell stood up with Adeline. Dob Shanley, cleaned up and miserable in a collar, stood up with Owen. Nell held the ring, which was Owen's mother's and had been in a tin box in the cupboard for 6 years. And Joss was given the job of holding the door and took it so seriously that he would not sit down through the whole ceremony. And Bertie fell asleep against Hattie Pell's shoulder before the vows and woke up during the singing and joined in loudly with words of her own invention. Afterward there was a supper on planks laid over sawhorses in the schoolyard, and somebody had a fiddle, and the whole valley ate cold beef and pie and danced in the dust until the light went. And Adeline Rourke, who had come off a freight wagon 3.5 weeks before, with $4.60 sewn into her cuff, stood in the schoolyard in the dusk with a wedding ring on her hand and watched her son teach 2 boys he had met that afternoon how to skip a flat rock, and could not entirely make it be real. Owen came and stood beside her with 2 cups of the punch that the ladies had made and that the men had improved without asking. "You've gone quiet," he said. "I have been trying all evening," she said, "to work out what you get out of this." He considered the question honestly, which was his way, standing there turning the cup. "This morning," he said, "I come around the corner of the barn, and your boy had got the manure fork and was moving the pile from where it was to where he decided it ought to be, which was 3 foot to the left and no better. And he'd been at it near an hour, and when he saw me, he stood up straight and got ready to be hollered at. And I have been alone on that place 6 years, Adeline, and in 6 years nobody has moved one single thing I did not move myself. Nothing gets shifted. Nothing gets left in the wrong place. You put a hammer down in September and it's laying there in March. There is no way I can tell you what that does to a man without sounding like I've gone soft in the head." He drank some of the punch. "So that's what I get. Somebody moved my manure pile 3 foot to the left for no reason at all. I'd not trade it for the biggest outfit on this side of the mountains." That was the closest Owen Talent came, in the first year, to saying anything of the sort out loud, and she carried it around for months. He stayed in the bunkhouse until the middle of August. He had said a month or a year, and he had meant it, and he never once crowded her, never once came up the porch steps at an hour that would have made a question of it. And Adeline came to understand in those weeks that she had married a man who would have gone on sleeping in that bunkhouse for a decade rather than ask her for something she had not offered. What changed it was not a grand thing. It was the middle of a hot Thursday, and she was hanging wash on the line behind the house, and he came up from the corral with his shirt over his shoulder and a gash across the back of his forearm from a wire he had been stretching, bleeding freely and taking no notice of it. And she made him sit on the chopping block, and she washed it out and stitched it with a needle from her sewing box and silk thread, and he sat perfectly still and watched her hands, and when she had done and tied it off, she found that her own hands were not steady and that she did not want to take them off his arm, and she looked up and he was looking at her. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then he said, "That bunkhouse stove smokes." "I know it does," she said. "I've known it since June." And he laughed, which she had not heard him do before, one short surprised bark of a laugh. And he moved his things up to the house that evening, and Nell and Joss regarded this development with the flat, unembarrassed acceptance of children who have decided already what a household is and are simply waiting for the adults to catch up. From that summer, the place began to come back. It had not been a failing outfit exactly when she came to it. Owen Talent was too good a stockman for that and too careful with money, and the ground was better than most in that valley, and the spring never quit. But it had been a place running on one man's hands and one man's flat, unbroken discipline, and nothing else. And there had been no margin in it anywhere and no purpose to it past getting through, and you could see that in every corner of it, in the good tools kept perfect, and the fences kept tight, and the garden plot standing empty in weeds, because a man alone will not cook a vegetable. Adeline broke that garden plot in her second week and had beans and turnips and cabbage out of it that first fall, late and small but hers. She put up 60 quarts of chokecherry and plum from the draws that nobody else in the valley bothered with. She got the hens laying properly by the simple expedient of shutting them up at night and feeding them at a fixed hour. And by September, there were eggs going down to Pell's store every Thursday on Shanley's wagon, and coming back as sugar and coffee and cloth and shoes for Joss, who had gone through his own in 11 weeks. Nell turned out to have a head for figures that startled everybody, including herself. Owen had kept his accounts in a tally book, in a hand that was clear enough, but a system that was nothing at all. And Nell got into it in October with a pencil, uninvited, and had it ruled into columns and totaled inside a week, and found 90 cents of arithmetic that had gone the wrong way in 1885, and presented this to Owen at supper with the air of an attorney. And Owen looked at the page a long time and then said, gravely, "Well, then I reckon the books are yours," and handed them across the table, and they stayed hers, in one form or another, for 51 years. Joss learned the creek. He was shown the parts that would take a person off their feet, as promised, on the second day, and having been shown them, he never went near them and never had to be told twice about anything else in his life. And by the end of that first summer, he could saddle the old gentle mare by standing on a bucket, and had been given a horse of his own to be responsible for, and had taken to riding out with Owen in the mornings, the two of them going off at a walk in the gray light with the boy's short legs stuck out sideways, talking the whole way about matters of state. And Bertie, who had been so quiet on the road that Adeline had begun to be afraid for her, opened out in that country like something set in water. She talked from July onward and did not stop for 20 years. Her first clear sentence, delivered at the supper table in the last week of that month with everybody listening, was, "This is our gate." The one man in that valley who said out loud what a certain number of people were thinking privately was Orland Reeve, and Adeline was always glad afterward that it had been him. Because Orland Reeve was not a bad man, only an old one who had buried too much. He ran cattle on the bench above them and had held that ground since '69, and had lost a wife to a fever and a son to a horse, and had been left with one grown boy in Montana who did not write. And he came down to the Talent Place in the second week of September to borrow a stretcher and settle a line of drift fence. And he stood in the yard with his hat pushed back and looked off down the road at the gate for a while, and finally said what he had come, partly to say. "That board," he said. "I know it. Your daddy's board. It is. Then you'll know what it's for." Reeve was not sneering. That was the thing Adeline remembered. He said it the way a man says a thing he believes and expects to be agreed with. "It's blood, Owen. That's what your old man had it for, and his old man before him. A man's name over his gate is what he's got instead of a family tree, out here where there ain't none. You put 4 strangers in it inside of one day, and you've made it mean nothing at all. It's a kindness. I don't say it ain't a kindness. And the woman seems capable, and them young ones is well enough. But a kindness ain't blood. And when you've got your own, and I hope you do, you're going to have 4 names in that board ahead of them that ain't yours. And you'll wish you'd thought harder about it on a May evening when you was feeling generous." Adeline was on the porch with a pan of beans in her lap, and she did not move and did not speak. And afterward Owen told her he had known she was there and had been glad of it, because he did not intend to say one thing to Orland Reeve and another thing in his own kitchen. Owen took his time. He picked up the fence stretcher and turned it over and set it down again. "Orland," he said, "how many head did you lose in the big storm in '86? You know what I lost. 60%, same as me. And when it was over, you rode down here in March with a load of hay you couldn't spare, and you left it in my corral and went home before I was up. Was that blood?" Reeve worked his jaw. "That's different. It ain't different, it's the same. You just don't like it named. Nobody in this valley is here by blood. My grandfather come out of Kentucky with nothing, and got taken in on the Willamette by a family he was not related to, and would have died without them, and that is the whole reason there is a board over that gate at all. He didn't cut it to keep folks out. He cut it because somebody had cut his name in a door when he was 19 and had no place, and he never got over it. Owen looked up at the bench and back. You want to know the truth of it, I'd have wrote that board out for them if they'd been nothing to me but 4 people the freighter set down at Pell's. I ain't as good a man as that, and I didn't have to be, because they were mine by then. Took me about 4 seconds in front of the store to work it out. You can hold with blood if you want to, but you'll not stand in my yard and tell me my board means nothing, because that board is the only thing I've got that's said anything true in 6 years. Orland Reeve looked at the ground for a good while. Then he said, "Well," and picked up the stretcher, and they went and fixed the drift fence and came back at noon and ate at that table, Five and Orland Reeve, and nothing more was said about it that day or for a long time after. But Adeline noticed in the following weeks that Reeve came down oftener than the fence required, and that he had begun bringing Joss things: a whetstone, a coil of light rope, a mouth harp that the whole family later had cause to regret, and that he called the children by their names in a slightly too loud voice, the way a man does when he is correcting something in himself and wants credit for it. He was, in the end, the second person in that country to cut a board. And that comes later. What Orland Reeve did do, without meaning to, was put a thought in Owen Tallant's head that would not come out again. He worried at it for 3 weeks. Adeline could see him at it, at the table and on horseback and lying awake, and she knew better than to draw it out of him before he had it finished, because he was a man who would not say a thing until he could say all of it. He brought it out at the end of the first week in October, at night, with the children asleep and the wind up. "That board's good for what it's good for," he said, "but it's a board. It'll burn. And Reeve's wrong about blood, but he's right that a thing needs to be more than a man's word out here, because a man's word dies with him. If I go off a horse tomorrow, there is not one piece of paper in this world that says those 3 are anything to this place. Your marriage lines make you my wife. There ain't a line anywhere makes them mine. The county'd hand this ground to a brother of my mother's in Iowa that I have not laid eyes on since I was 14, and it would put your children out of the only place they've got, and it would be lawful." Adeline had known that. She had known it since June and had not let herself look straight at it. "It costs money," she said. "It does, and it means the court. It does. 2 days each way to Lander and a judge that sits 4 times a year, and papers, and a fee, and a man from the county asking you questions about your first husband that are not his business." He turned his head on the pillow. "I'd like to do it in the spring term. I'd like it done before the calves are sold, so if it takes the whole of the calf money, there's nothing to argue about. And I'd like it to be them that says yes or no, the 2 big ones, not us. If Nell don't want to be a Tallant, she don't have to be. And I'll not have her carrying my name, because 2 grown people arranged it over her head at night." So they asked them. It was done on a Sunday afternoon in October at the kitchen table, with the door open and the yellow leaves coming off the creek willows. And Owen laid it out to Nell and Joss exactly as he would have laid a business matter out to a grown man, no coaxing in it anywhere, that there was a thing called adoption, that it meant a judge writing in a book that he was their father-in-law, the same as if he had been from the start, that their name would change to his, that it could not be undone afterward, by him or by anybody, that it did not take one thing away from the father they had lost and was not meant to, and that they could say no and everything would stay precisely as it was, board and house and horse and all. Joss said yes before the last sentence was out. Nell did not. Nell sat with her hands flat on the table and thought about it for what her mother later swore was 2 full minutes. And then she said, "Would he still be on the stone?" She meant Tom. Tom Rourke had been dead 2 years that October. He had been a grading contractor's man on the Burlington line, a big, cheerful, careless fellow who could lift the back of a wagon off the ground and could not hold $1 overnight, and a bank of frozen fill had come down on him in a cut outside Plattsmouth in October of 1885, and that had been the end of it. There had been no insurance. There had been no property. There had been a brother in Ohio who wrote to say he was sorry for her trouble and could not help. The Rourke name, which Tom had worn lightly and cheerfully all his life, turned out to be worth nothing at all once he was not in it, and by the time Adeline had sold the furniture and paid the doctor and the undertaker, what she had left of her husband was a name her children carried and could not eat. There was no stone, and Adeline had never told her so. The grave in Plattsmouth had a board with a number on it because there had been no money for anything else, and it was the one thing about the whole disaster that Adeline had never been able to get past. She opened her mouth to answer and could not. Owen said, "There's no stone yet." "Why not?" "Because there was no money for one," said Owen, "and there is now. And there'll be one before the year's out. And it'll say his whole name and both the dates, and it'll say he was your father, and I'll pay for it, and I'll not have any argument about that from anybody at this table." He said it looking at Nell, and not at Adeline, but he said it loud enough for Adeline. And Adeline got up and went out to the porch and stood there for a while with her arms folded and the yellow leaves coming down. When she came back and Nell said, "Then yes." They went to Lander in the last week of April in 1888, all 5 of them, 2 days each way in the spring wagon with a tent and a camp kit, which the children regarded as the greatest event of their lives to that point, and which Adeline remembered chiefly as 4 nights of very little sleep. The judge was a dry old man named Vroom, who heard 11 matters that day and gave theirs 19 minutes. He asked Adeline whether the natural father was dead and how, and she told him. He asked Owen what his means were, and Owen told him to the dollar, including the 190 on the hay mower, which was by then 40. He asked Nell, being 809 by that spring, whether she understood what was being done, and Nell said, "You're going to write it in a book so it can't come undone." And Judge Vroom looked at her over his spectacles for a moment and said, "That is a better statement of it than the one I generally get from the attorneys," and signed. It cost $11.50 in fees and about 9 days of work at the wrong time of year, and Owen Talent came out of that courthouse into the April sun on the steps and stood there holding a folded paper and had to be spoken to twice before he heard. They came home on the 2nd of May. And on the 3rd, which was a Sunday, he took the plank down again. Adeline came out and found him with the sawhorses set and the jack plane out and the 5 names going away under it, and she said, "Owen Talent, what in the world?" And he said, "It's not true anymore. It's got to be planed when it's not true," and went on planing. What he cut that second time was not 5 names. It was 5 names in a row along the bottom of the board, the same 5. Adeline and Nell and Josiah and Bernadette and Owen, and above them across the whole head of the plank in letters twice the size, deeper than any letter he had ever cut in his life. So deep that he broke a chisel on the last of it and had to go to Camas Bend on Monday for another. 1 word, Talent. It took him the whole of Sunday and half of Monday, and he cut the last letter by lantern light the same as before, and when he hung it back up the board was so heavy with cut wood that he had to make new brackets for it out of a wagon tire at Reeves Forge. And it hung there, all told, for 39 years. The country tested them the following winter, as that country always did sooner or later, and it did it in the middle of January in the year 1889, and the way it happened was so ordinary at the start that nobody in the house thought anything of it. Owen rode out after breakfast on the 9th to open a water hole on the lower meadow and look at the drift fence on the north line, which was a 4-hour job in decent weather. And the weather was decent when he left. Gray and still and about 20 degrees, the kind of morning that country hands over to you at that season with a perfectly straight face. He said he would be back by 2. He took an axe and a coil of wire, and no bedroll, because a man does not carry a bedroll to fix a fence 4 miles from his own stove. At 11:30, the wind came around into the north, and the temperature began to go down in a way that Adeline, who had been in that country 20 months, had never seen. She was in the kitchen with Bertie when the light changed. It did not darken so much as flatten, everything outside going the same shadowless white-gray at once. And then the first of it came across the meadow like a wall being pushed, and inside of 10 minutes she could not see the barn from the kitchen window, and the wind was making a sound under the eaves that she had no name for and did not want one. Nell came in from the henhouse, with her braid frozen stiff and snow driven into the weave of her coat so hard it had to be picked out. Joss got the woodbox filled to the lid, and then filled the space behind the stove, besides, on his own, without being told, at 9 years old, because he had ridden out in that country all summer, and had worked out for himself what the wind meant. By 1 o'clock they could not see the pump, which was 11 steps from the door. By 2 he was not back, and Adeline began to understand what the rest of the day was going to be. She did not let it show, and she would say afterward that keeping her face in order that afternoon was the hardest physical labor she ever performed. She kept the children working. She had Nell melt snow and keep the reservoir full, and Joss build up the fire and bank it, and Bertie roll bandage strips out of an old sheet, which was make work, and Nell knew it was make work and said nothing. She strung a length of clothesline from the porch post to the barn door and out to the woodpile, hand over hand 3 trips, so that a person could get to the stock and back without being lost in 50 feet of open yard. She got the lantern lit and set in the window at 3 o'clock, in full daylight, which tells you what the daylight was, and at 4, when it was as dark as a cellar and the wind had risen instead of falling, she took the ledger down off the shelf and sat at the table and made herself write out the tally of the hay in the stackyard, because her mother had told her once that when there is nothing to be done, do arithmetic, and it was the only advice her mother ever gave her that turned out to be worth anything. Nell was the one who worked it out. She came and stood at her mother's elbow at 4:30 and said, "He'd have started back when it turned." He would. Then he's between the north line and here, and he'd not try for the house across the flat in this. He'd get down out of the wind. "Yes, there's the old lambing shed in the willow bottom on the section line," said Nell. "It's got 3 walls and a roof on half of it. Joss says they go by it every time they ride the north line. That's the only thing between here and there." Adeline looked at her daughter, who was 9 years and 4 months old, and who had just laid the whole thing out in the flat, orderly way she laid out a column of figures, and understood that Nell had been working on it since 2 o'clock, and had waited to speak until she was sure, which was a thing Nell did for the rest of her life. "We can't get there tonight," Adeline said. "No," Nell agreed. "But we'll know where to go at first light. And he'll know we'll know, because he told Joss about the shed himself." That, in the end, was the whole of it. Owen Tallant spent that night in the corner of a 3-walled lambing shed in the willow bottom, 1.75 miles from his own kitchen, with his horse in the dry corner and his saddle blanket over the both of them, and a small, mean fire of willow that took him 40 minutes to start and never once got warm. And he was there because he had done exactly the arithmetic his stepdaughter had done, in reverse, on horseback, at 2 in the afternoon with the wind taking the breath out of his mouth. He came up out of the bottom at 7:30 the next morning, in weather that had blown itself down to a hard blue cold, leading the horse, with his beard frozen white and his left hand in a condition that took 3 weeks to come right and cost him the top joint of the little finger. And the first thing he saw when he cleared the willows was 3 figures coming down the meadow toward him, breaking trail through drifts up to the woman's waist. And the boy had the coal shovel, and the girl had the coil of rope, and their mother had the lantern still burning in broad daylight, because she had not thought to blow it out. They met in the middle of the meadow in the snow. Nobody made any speech about it. Joss got to him first and grabbed him around the middle and got hold of 2 handfuls of frozen coat and would not let go, and had to be walked back to the house that way, attached. Nell took the horse's rein without being asked, and led him in. Adeline walked beside her husband with her arm through his and said, in a perfectly level voice, "You are 3/4 of an hour late," and Owen Talent, whose face was too stiff with cold to make any expression at all, said, "The pump chain," which had nothing to do with anything and made no sense whatever, and which was, for the next 4 decades in that family, the accepted answer to any question about why anybody was late for anything. He sat by the stove all that day with his hand in a basin, going gray and then red, and Adeline worked on it, and at noon he said, out of nowhere, she named the shed. She did. She's 9. She is. I was going to say I'd have been all right, regardless, he said, which is true. Another night in that shed and I'd have been in poor shape, but I'd have been alive. So it don't signify. It signifies to me, though, that's all I'm saying, and then I'll leave off. There was a time I'd have froze up there and nobody in the world would have started looking till Shanley come through on Thursday and found the stock hadn't been fed. That's what I had, 20 months back. Now I come up out of a willow bottom and there's 3 people coming down the meadow at me with a shovel. He looked at his hand in the basin. A man ought not to have to be 40 years old to find that out. The country did not ease off for the rest of that winter. It was the coldest anybody in Camas Bend could remember. Colder than the terrible year of '86, though there was less snow. And the family got through it the way everybody in that valley got through it. On hay they had cut themselves, and beef they had grown, and beans and potatoes and chokecherry jelly and coffee stretched with roasted barley, and by March they were down to counting the eggs. They lost 9 head. Reeve lost 31. The outfit at the head of the creek that had come in 2 years before with borrowed money and no hay lost the whole of it and was gone by June, and their ground went back to the county and was bought by a family from Nebraska, and that is the way of a hard country and always was. But in the last week of February, with the drifts still 6 feet in the lee of the barn, Adeline stood at the stove one morning and put the coffee pot down carefully and said, "Owen," and told him, and he sat perfectly still on the bench with his boot in his hand for so long that she said his name again. Their son was born on the 11th of September in the year 1889 in the back room, with Hattie Pell and a neighbor woman named Cordy Innes in attendance, and Owen Talent walking a track in the dirt of his own yard from the pump to the gate and back for 11 hours. They called him Amos for Owen's father. He was a large, loud, healthy boy with a black shock of hair, and he was, from about his 4th day, the personal property of his sisters, who fought over him with a ferocity that alarmed everybody. And on the 2nd Sunday in September, when Adeline was up and the baby was 10 days old, and the weather held fine. Owen Talent took the plank down for the third time. She came out with the baby wrapped and sat on the porch step to watch him do it, and this time all 4 children came and sat along the edge of the porch too, in a row, because by then everybody in that house understood what the sawhorses in the yard meant. He planed off Talent, which hurt him. She could see it, all that work going up in shavings. He planed off the 5 names. He took it down to clean wood, and he sighted it, and he stepped off the spaces with his rule, and he found that 6 names and the surname would not fit on that plank at any size worth cutting. He stood there a while. Then he said, "Nell, fetch the rule out here, and check my figuring. I want it done proper." And Nell came and measured it herself twice and said, "It won't go. Not unless you cut them small, and small letters weather out. That's what I make of it." "Then you want a bigger board," said Nell. So Amos Talent's arrival cost his father a 2-day trip to the sawmill at Bear Draw and $3.40 for a piece of clear white for 10 feet long and 12 inches deep and 2 inches thick, which was more board than any gate in that county carried, and which took 2 men to hang. And on that board, over 3 Sundays that autumn, Owen cut Talent across the head in letters a hand high, and beneath it, in a row, Adeline, Nell, Josiah, Bernadette, Amos, Owen, and left, past the last of it, a good clear 1.5 feet of empty fur, which nobody in the family ever once mentioned out loud, and which everybody understood exactly. The old plank he did not burn. He cut it down to a length of about 3 feet, planed it clean on the face, and hung it on the wall in the front room over the door, and when people asked, he said it was a piece of board, and when the children asked, he told them the whole of it, every time, the same way, and they never got tired of hearing it, and neither, in the end, did he. The board did its work in ways nobody planned, and the plainest of them happened at the schoolhouse. Camas Ben School ran 3 months in winter and 2 in spring, and had in the year 1890 19 scholars in one room, and there was a boy in it 2 years older than Nell, named Curtis Loam, who had made it his business since the previous term to remind her in the yard, out of the teacher's hearing, that she was not really a talent, that everybody knew where she came from, that a person could put on any name they liked the way a person could put on a coat. Nell had handled it herself for a year in her own way, which was to say nothing and beat him at everything, and she had never brought a word of it home. It ended on a Monday in February. The teacher that term was a young man from Cheyenne who had been in the valley 6 weeks and had taken to walking out the North Road on Saturdays for the exercise, and he had walked as far as the Talent Crossing and back, and on the Monday, apropos of nothing but geography, he set the class to copying out from a reader, and then remarked to the room at large that he had seen the handsomest piece of letter-cutting he had ever laid eyes on out on the creek road, a name board with the whole family in it, and that whoever had done it had a better hand with a chisel than most men had with a pen. And he named the names off from memory because he had stood and read them twice, all 6, in order. 19 children heard him. Curtis Loam heard him. It was not done for Nell, and the teacher never knew he had done anything at all. And Nell Talent, who was 10 years old and had been holding a small hard thing in her chest since the previous term, put her head down over her copybook and went on writing and did not look up. And there was never one more word about it in that schoolyard from that day, because in a country where nothing was written down, a thing that had been cut a 1/4 inch deep into fur and read aloud by a schoolmaster in front of 19 witnesses was simply and finally a fact. And children understand facts a great deal better than grown people give them credit for. She told her mother about it 11 years later, at her own wedding, in the back room, while Adeline was pinning her veil. Adeline put the pins down and said, "Why did you never say?" And Nell said, "Because it stopped," and picked the pins up and handed them back, and that was the whole of it. Adeline told Owen that night. He listened all the way through and looked into the fire and said, "That schoolmaster ought to have a ham," and sent him one, in February of the following year, without any explanation whatsoever. And the man ate it in Cheyenne and never did work out why. The second board on Camas Creek went up in the spring of 1890, and it belonged to Orland Reef. He came down one evening in April and stood in the yard the way he had stood in it the September he came to talk about blood, and turned his hat around in his hands, and finally said that his boy in Montana had written for the first time in 4 years, and had a wife and 2 little ones, and was thinking of coming back to the bench in the fall to take over the outfit, and that he had been trying for 2 weeks to write an answer and had not been able to get past the first line. "I've no gift for saying a thing," Orland Reeves said. "You have. You said it to me right out in this yard, and I chewed on it near 3 years. He looked at the road. "I'd take it kindly if you'd cut me a board." "Cut it yourself," said Owen. "I can't cut letters. Never could." "Then I'll show you how," said Owen, "and you'll cut it yourself, because it don't work if somebody else does it." So Orland Reeve, who was 63 years old and had not made anything with his hands but wire and horseshoes since the war, spent 11 evenings that April and May at the talent workbench with a scrap of pine and a chisel, learning to cut a letter the way Owen cut one, which was the way a good workman works, slowly at the layout and fast at the cut, tapping in the shoulders of each letter first and then paring out the waist in clean lifts, and swearing, and being corrected on his layout by a 10-year-old girl who had inherited her stepfather's exactness about shoulders and depth. And on the 4th of June, he hung a board over his own gate on the bench with 4 names on it, his own and his son's and the wife's he had never met and the first grandchild's, and left room for the second, because he had not been able to make out the spelling of it from the letter and did not want to get it wrong. His son came back in October. Reeve met the wagon at the crossroads and drove them home the long way, up the bench road, so they would come at the gate from the east with the low sun on it, and his daughter-in-law read that board out loud from the wagon seat with her own name in it and cried. And Orland Reeve got down and walked ahead of the team the last 200 yards so nobody would see his face. After that, it went the way such things go in a small country, which is to say slowly and then all at once. The Inneses put one up. The family from Nebraska at the head of the creek put one up, with 9 names on it, and had to use 2 boards. The blacksmith at Camas Bend cut his on a piece of oak wagon tongue and hung it over the door of the shop instead of a gate, because he had no gate. Hattie Pell would not have one, on the grounds that a store is a store, but she kept a ledger book behind the counter with everybody's names in it and called it the same thing, and when a new family came into that country she wrote them into it, and there is a school in that county now that has that ledger under glass. By the turn of the century there were, by Nell's count, and Nell counted everything, 31 boards between the crossroads and the head of the creek, and a traveler coming up that road in 1899 would have ridden under a name board about every mile and a half, and would have had no idea he was looking at anything but a local habit. That is what it became. It stopped being the talent board and became the way it was done on Camas Creek, and by the time the children of that valley were grown, most of them did not know it had a beginning, and would have told you their grandfather always did it that way, and in a manner of speaking they were right. Nobody in that country ever called it what it was. Adeline Talent called it, once, in a letter to a cousin in Illinois, a way of writing people down where there is no paper, and then crossed it out because it sounded grand. And the cousin's daughter found the letter in a trunk in 1951 with the line still legible under the ink. The years came on the way years do in a place where the work is the same every season and the seasons are what change. There was the good stretch through the 90s when beef came back and they paid off the ground and bought the Reeve bench when Reeve's son sold out in 98. And the bad 2 years after the turn of the century when the price fell out from under everybody. And the summer of 1911 when Hale took the whole hay crop in 20 minutes and Owen came in and sat down and said, "Well, we'll eat beans." And they did, and it was fine. There was a barn raised in 93 that stood until 1962. There was a second son, Wesley, born in 92, who lived 9 days. And who was the only name Owen Talent ever had to plane off that board, and he did it alone at night in November, and would not let anybody come out, and Adeline let him have it alone, because she had learned by then which of his griefs wanted company, and which did not. There was a well drilled in 96. There was a windmill in 1904. There was a telephone line brought up the creek in 1919. And the first automobile through the Camas Bend crossroads in 1913, which Bertie ran a quarter-mile down the wagon road to see and talked about for a month. Nell Talent kept the books of that outfit from the age of 9 to the age of 60. She married late, at 28, a school teacher named Pryor, who came out from Ohio and stayed, and they built on the bench, and she went on keeping her father's accounts as well as her own. And in 1922, when the bank at Lander went under and took half the ranchers in that county with it, the Talent place came through without a scratch, because Nell Pryor had not liked the look of the bank's statement in 1920 and had quietly moved the money. And it was said in that country for years afterward that the Talents were lucky. And it was not luck, and Nell never once corrected anybody. Josiah Talent took over the running of the place in 1915 when Owen's back finally quit on him, and ran it 41 years, and was known between the mountains and the river as a plain, honest, hard-headed cattleman who would not be hurried and could not be cheated. He was asked twice to stand for the legislature, and refused both times on the grounds that he had cattle. And Bernadette, who was Bertie until she was about 19 and Miss Talent after that to 3 generations of children, took the school at Camas Bend in 1904 and taught in that valley for 38 years. And there is a road named for her that she would have hated. Amos went to the war in 1917 and came home in 1919 thinner and quieter, and married a girl from Bear Draw, and took up ground of his own north of the creek, and cut a board for his gate the first week he owned it, before he had a roof up, which his mother heard about from Hattie Pell's granddaughter and did not mention to him for 11 years. Owen and Adeline grew old on that place in the ordinary way. She kept the garden until she was 74. He rode until he was 66 and drove a wagon after that, and was contemptuous of automobiles all his life, and was driven to town in one twice a month by his son without complaining out loud. They were not a demonstrative couple. In 40 years the children saw them embrace perhaps a dozen times, and heard perhaps as many endearments, and every one of the 4 could have told you the exact circumstance of each. What they saw instead every day of their childhoods was a man who did not sit down to a meal before his wife did, and a woman who did not go to bed before her husband came in, and 2 people who conducted the whole business of a working ranch across a kitchen table for 4 decades, with almost no raised voices. And if you had asked any of the 4 children what a marriage was, they would have described that and not been able to say what was remarkable about it. It was remarkable. Adeline knew what it was. She had been married before, to a man she had loved and who had loved her and who had left her with 3 children and a name that was worth nothing. And she knew the difference between being loved and being counted on. And she had had the great fortune to get both in one life, which is more than most. And she said so once to Nell in her 70s, and never again. Owen Talent died on the 2nd of March in the year 1926, at the age of 73, in the back room of that house, of pneumonia that came out of a cold he had got helping Joss dig a heifer out of a snowdrift he had no business being near. He was 3 days about it, and knew from the first morning how it was going to go. And he spent those 3 days getting his affairs into an order that they had already been in for 20 years. And being visited, and being embarrassed about being visited. Orland Reeves' grandson came. Hattie Pell's daughter came. Dob Shanley, who was 91 and had not been on a wagon in a decade, was driven out by a great-nephew and sat in the front room for an hour and looked at the old 3-foot piece of plank over the door and said, "I read that board off my wagon seat in May of '87 and I have not got over it yet," and went home. On the last afternoon, Owen asked for the 4 of them and they came in, Nell 47, Josiah 45, Bernadette 42, Amos 36, and stood around that bed, and he looked at them and said, "You'll keep the board." They said they would. "It ain't a keepsake," he said. "You keep it true. When a one of you goes, you plane it. When a one of you comes, you cut it. That's the whole of it, and it don't want any speeches." Nell said, "We know how it's done." "You do," he said. "I never had to tell you that either." And then he asked them all to go out except their mother, and they went. What was said in that room was never told to anybody, but Adeline came out about an hour later and said he was gone, and she was perfectly steady, and she went and put the coffee on because there were people in the house, and Bernadette said afterward that her mother made coffee for 11 people and washed the cups before anybody saw her cry. They buried him on the low rise east of the house where his mother and father and the 9-day baby were, and half that county came, and Joss planed the board that same week because his father had told him not to leave it, and cut it fresh with 5 names where 6 had been. And the space where Owen had been cut into the fur for 37 years was so deep worn into the grain that in the right light at evening you could still read the shadow of it, and any of that family would show you if you asked. Adeline Talent lived 9 years more. She stayed in the house and would not be moved to town, and Nell came down every day, and she kept her mind entire to the end and her hands busy, and in the last years she took to sitting on the porch in the afternoon with a shawl over her knees. And the shawl was blue, deep cornflower blue, the wool of it gone thin as paper in places and mended in 11, and it was the same shawl she had worn off Dob Shanley's freight wagon on the 10th of May in 1887, and she had never once in 48 years let anybody give her a new one. She died in her sleep on the 14th of October in 1935, at the age of 78, and Joss planed the board on the 16th and cut it fresh with 4 names on it, and that was the first time since the spring of 1887 that the plank over the Talent gate had carried no name that had come off that freight wagon. Word got about. There were, at her funeral, more than 300 people in a valley that had perhaps 600 in it, counting the babies, and they came because she had been the school's treasurer for 30 years and had lent money to people who did not tell anybody and had sat up with the sick in 11 households in the influenza year. And because of the board. The preacher, a young man who had been in that country 4 years, had prepared some remarks about a mother in Israel and got about a third of the way into them before he stopped and put the paper in his pocket and said that he had been told a thing that morning that he could not improve on, and would say instead, which was that a woman had got off a wagon at Pell's store with 3 children and $4, and had told a man she had never met that she had nothing to give them but a name that was worth nothing, and that the man had gone home and cut 5 names in a board, and that there were now, by his own count that week, 44 gates in that county with names cut over them, and that if anybody present wanted a sermon on what one plain public act can do in a country, they might ride out any road they chose and read it off the gateposts. The Talent place stayed in the family. Josiah ran it until 1956, and his son after him, and his granddaughter after that, and it is running yet, or was the last anybody checked. And the ground is the same ground, and the spring above the house has still never gone dry. The house burned in 1948, a chimney fire in February, and everything in it went. The tin box, and the mother's ring, and the letters, and the old 3-foot plank off the wall over the door. All of it, and that was a hard loss, and is still spoken of. But the gate stood a 1/4 mile down the wagon road, and was never in any danger, and the 10-foot piece of clear white fur that Owen Talent hauled home from the Bear Draw Mill for $3.40 in the autumn of 1889 hung on its wagon tire brackets through the fire and through everything else, and it was taken down at last in 1961 because the fur had finally gone punky at the west end, and a new one was cut and hung the same week by a man who had learned to cut letters from Josiah, who had learned from Owen, who had learned from his father, who had learned it off a cabin door in the Willamette country in the year 1851. The old board went to the County Historical Society at Lander, where it is on the wall, and the card beside it says only that it is a ranch gate sign from Camas Creek, dated about 1890, maker unknown. That is not right, and it hardly matters. What is on it is 6 names in a row, under a surname a hand high, and the last of the 6 is worn to a shadow, and if you stand close in the afternoon, when the light comes in low across it, you can still read every letter of a woman's name that a man cut into clean pine by lantern light on the evening she told him the truth and expected to be sent away. It is the first name on the board. He cut it first on purpose. He never said why, and nobody in that family ever needed to ask.